Hello everybody and welcome to this, my second of 3 videos on the Canon Eos Rebel T6i. In the first video we talked about what all of the stuff, the buttons and dials are. In the third video we'll go in depth into the menu system. But in this video we're going to talk about how to use the different things on this camera to take photos and what many of them do. Basically, if it's not in the menu, we're going to talk about it in this video. First thing first, there is nothing that we can do with this camera unless it's got a good battery in it. So we're going to lift up the battery chamber right there, pop out the battery, and if your battery is dead, you just have to grab a different one and put it in. This uses a Canon LP-E17 battery. So the way that it goes in is that the part of the battery that has the matte finish and the text on it goes toward the front of the camera. Come on. There we go, just like that. And we've changed the battery, and we can start taking photos. Next thing let's talk about is how to mount and unmount lenses on this camera. The T6i, being an APS-C format camera, can take either EF or EF-S lenses. So, to remove the lens, we push down on the lens release button here. Now we're going to turn it counter or anti-clockwise, and we can remove the lens. Here's the lens mount. Here's an EF mount lens, red dot. This is an EF-S mount lens and it has a white square. So the lens that we're going to put on will line up that symbol with the proper symbol on the mount. If I was going to put this EF-S lens back on, that white square would line up with that white square. Drop it into place, turn it clockwise until it clicks, and we've mounted this lens. To mount an EF lens, we just line up the red dot with the red dot, turn it clockwise, and when it clicks, we've mounted the EF lens. Now that we've got a lens on and a charged battery, we need to be able to store our photos, so we're going to need a memory card. Those are accessed on the memory card door right here. And we'll pull this out. To eject a memory card, you simply push it in and then remove it. To insert it, you put it label side up when you are holding the camera this way. Push it in until it clicks, and then you've inserted it. This can take SD, SDHC, or SDXC with UHS-1 compatibility memory cards. UHS-2, as of this video's recording, are pretty much brand new on the market. If you see an SDXC, then it's going to be UHS-1 in all probability. This is UHS-1. And we can see that because there's a little symbol there that has a U and a 1. There you go, you can probably see that now. Also, you can tell a card is UHS-1 because it has a single row of contacts here. The UHS-2 cards have a second row of contacts right here. So, UHS-1 cards, the maximum size of the card capability wasn't stated anywhere that I could find in the manual or online for this, but the SDXC standard would mean that this should be able to take memory cards up to 2 terabytes. I tried 512 gigabytes, which is the largest that I have, and it worked just fine. However, being a 24 megapixel sensor, you don't need a 512 gigabyte SD card. 128 will give you something like 3,500 photos. Next thing let's do is talk about how to use the flash with this camera. There's a built-in pop-up flash right here, which you can turn on, which you can access by when the camera's on by pushing this flash button on the side of the camera, and that pop-up flash will turn on just like that, or pop up and now it's ready to use. You can also use an external flash by plugging it in to the hot shoe, and there are a lot of flashes that this camera can use, and many of the Canon Speedlight flashes give you some really interesting capabilities with this camera as well, because it is a pretty advanced model in terms of its compatibility with Canon accessories. The hot shoe, the flash sync on this is 1/200th of a second. Now what does that mean? Cameras like this have a focal plane shutter, and there's a curtain that blocks the sensor, and when you take a picture, the curtain drops, and then the sensor is exposed to light, and then a second one closes, and then they reset like this. With a 1/200th of a second sync speed, what that means is that at 1/200th of a second, the first curtain opens. When it finishes traveling to the bottom of the camera, the entire sensor is open to light for approximately 1/200th of a second. The second curtain closes, and then they reset like that. Okay, But this has a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed, right? So what if I take a 1/4000th of a second exposure? Well, the first curtain opens, and then the second one's going to come in right behind it like that, and then they're going to reset. So the shutter speed isn't controlled by how fast the curtains move, but by how long the gap between the first and second curtain is. So if you used a flash, just a standard flash, at 1/4000th of a second, you just have a little sliver of exposed image on your frame, and then the rest of it would be dark. All right, well, what about a half-second exposure? Well, the first curtain would open, and then the entire sensor would be exposed to light for, let's call it a half second. And then the second curtain would close and they'd reset. So 1/200th of a second is the fastest shutter speed at which the flash can be used correctly. Anything faster requires high-speed sync, which I don't have the ability to demonstrate with my equipment, and anything slower is just fine. So let's talk about some technique for using flash to get you set up to use it well. What I'm about to show you is the worst possible place to have a flash on your camera. Yes, the built-in flash is the worst possible place to put a flash and have your images turn out well. Why? Well, think about the way that we see people when we're outdoors and the sun is above us, or at night under a street light that is above us, or indoors with ceiling lights that are, hey, above us. You've probably picked up on a theme there. Our brains are hardwired to see lighting from above as natural. So when the light leaves the flash from your pop-up flash, it leaves like this. It reaches your subject, bounces off of them, and comes back through your lens to your sensor. And that light is very flat, and it makes your subjects look flat. And that's not flattering to anyone. So if you want to have your flash use look good for your subjects and flatter them, you want to have your flash replicate the way that we see people and other things all the time with light above us. This right here is the second worst configuration you can have for a flash, because the flash is right above your lens pointing forward. There are some things you can do with this setting that will make this better. The first, of course, is to buy a articulating flash. If you tilt the flash upward at the ceiling and you bounce the light off of the ceiling, what you've done is you've used this light setup to replicate the way that we see light, because the light will reach the ceiling, bounce off the ceiling, reach your subject, and then back to your lens, which will make it look like they're being lit from above, because they are. If they're in front of you, you can tilt this a little bit forward, and that will give you good control over how much lighting is preserved versus how much is lost behind you, which would happen if you just tilted this straight up. Okay, but I might not always be where there's a ceiling, or it might be painted dark, or it might be 30 feet up. This isn't going to work. No, it's not. In that case, one thing you can do is get a fully articulating flash. This one just tilts. There are also ones that rotate, so you can bounce the flash off of a wall, and that will replicate fairly well natural lighting, or at least it will be better than pointing the flash straight at your subject. Okay, but I'm going to be outside in a field. There aren't going to be any walls. If you get an RF trigger for this and connect the receiver to your flash, then what you can do is use the autofocus on your lens to focus and handhold your flash however you want. You can hold this way above your head and point it in the general direction of your subject, and that will give you the ability to somewhat replicate overhead lighting. So there are ways to do flash work with this camera really well, even if you don't have the nicest flash ever made. All of those things that I just described to you, by the way, can be done with an El Cheapo $5, thrift store find flash. Yes, flashes don't have to be super expensive to be used well. Okay, so now that we've talked about some basic technique, let's go through a lot of the camera-specific stuff and look at what it does. So for this, the first thing we're going to talk about is the display button. And if I push the display button, it turns the display on and off. That is its one job. Okay, let's turn this back on. Next thing we're going to do is talk about the ISO button. Push the ISO button, and you can now use the command wheel or the rear control pad, left and right only, you cannot go up and down, to select the ISO that you would like to shoot with, anywhere from auto to 12,800. In general, even though this is a fairly new camera, you'll want to keep the ISO 3200 or below for the best results. Pushing it much beyond that is going to introduce a lot of color problems and digital noise. Fast ISOs like 12,800 are a good way to take a 1 or 2 second exposure of a night scene and just verify that your framing is correct before dialing the ISO back and using the actual exposure sensitivity that you want to use. All right, here's an AF point selection button. There's another one back here. They do the exact same thing. So I'm going to push the one in the back and it brings up this menu. I'm going to push the one on top and it brings up this menu. Same thing. These are your AF point options right here. So right now we have auto select 19 AF points and we can navigate through these. Oops, that was not right. We can navigate through these with the cross pad, right? Nope. We navigate through these by pushing the AF button. Manual select one and manual select zone. Okay, so let's start with this one. This means that there are 19 autofocus points, which there are, and the camera will automatically select the autofocus point that it determines to be the best for the photo that it thinks you want to take. We'll go now to manual select zone autofocus. There are 5 zones with this camera. And what you can do is use the command wheel to scroll through them. What's going to happen is that the zones that are lit up, so these 4 right now, or these 4, these 9, the camera will limit the autofocus to these specific zones, okay? All right, what good is this? Well, let's say, for instance, that you're going to go take a picture of some action, and you know that you're going to frame the action over on this side of the frame. Maybe you've got the goal for your kid's soccer match over on this side of the frame. Well, if you put all of your autofocus over here and you set up your composition as you want with the goal over here, and then the kids are going to be doing some action over here as they run up to make the goal, your camera will only select things that are in this zone for autofocus confirmation, meaning that the kid's doing other stuff in the background behind your kid who's about to make their soccer goal. The camera's not going to focus on them. It's only going to focus on your kid as they make the soccer goal right over here. This could be really good for center compositions like portraits or center composing photos in general. Manual selection of one point will limit the camera to a single autofocus point, and you get to pick which one it is. It's a little bit easier, come on, to use the cross pad for selecting your manual autofocus point, as you can see here. All right, so how would this be good? This is if you know exactly where your focus point is going to be. Let's say you're taking portrait orientation portraits, and you know that you're going to have your person's face. You're doing a whole corporate shoot. There's 200 people. All of the photos need to be composed the same way. You're going to have all of them portrait orientation with the face up here and then shoulders down here, okay? If you set your autofocus point up here, then you can keep your autofocus locked to, say, an eye, or their left eye, or their right eye, or the bridge of their nose with enough of a depth of field. Come on. I'm doing this blind, I apologize. There we go. And the bridge of their nose with enough depth of field to get their eyes in focus, and then every composition will be the same. That can make it really easy, for instance, if you wanted to crop out the bottom of every single one of those portraits to make them a square format. Every one of them would be aligned and focused in the same point, and it would make your job really easy. If you know that you're going to take macros of something or product photos and they're all going to be center framed, you could link your autofocus point just to the very center of the image, and then you could just put everything in the center and you'd be good to go. In general, nope, there we go. In general, autofocus, auto selection is a good general shooting mode that you can use for most of your work. Next thing we're going to talk about is this button right here on the back. This asterisk button. And we're going to talk about this in video 3 in depth. I just want to go over that. We're going to cover it in video 3. What this does is this is your auto exposure or autofocus lock, depending on how you have it configured. There's a whole menu section on this button with 4 or 5 different options on what you can make it do. And like I said, How this behaves will be covered in video 3 with explanations about what each of those options does. While we're here on the back, let's go over the rest of the back buttons. This is the menu button. And what the menu button does is it brings up the menus. And all of these items we're going to go through in video 3. So every single one of these tabs we'll cover then. The info button, let's turn on the display. If you press it, it brings up a screen that shows you what your current settings are, just so you can verify that you have everything set up the way that you want them. So if you're going to go do a long shoot, and let's say you're outside and you want to make sure that your white balance, where is it? Here it is. White balance, shift, and bracketing is not on, then you can make sure it isn't. If you might want to do some video work or some live view shooting, you can make sure that's enabled, just like that. And that's it. This is the only information you get. This right here is the live view video mode button. So if we switch into live view, you can see that what's coming through the lens to the sensor is now visible on the screen. The other thing you can do with this button is switch to movie mode. In movie mode, live view is always going to be active, and then this button starts recording a video and then stops recording a video. We're going to jump back up to the top of the camera really quickly, because some of the things that we're going to have to talk about next are important to understand before we get into other parts of what's going on in the back of the camera. We're going to talk about the mode dial up here. These are your shooting modes, and there are so many of them. In general, the modes you should be using the most are these 4 here, P, TV, AV, and M. So we're going to go over those first. And then these scene modes are very specific things that you can use, but realistically, if you understand your camera's settings, everything on this side of the dial becomes completely obsolete. P stands for program mode. Basically, with program mode, the camera is going to determine the best settings to take a photo, and that's going to be aperture and shutter speed. I believe an auto ISO will also determine the best ISO. One of the things about program mode that you can do is program shift. So in program mode with this camera, if I adjust the command wheel, I can force it to use slightly different settings, just like that. Okay. On the back of the camera, there's the AV button. If we push the AV button, you'll see that these 2 yellow indicators appeared. We can now, we can now program shift. Now watch that little white square as I rotate the command wheel. We can force the camera to over or underexpose images in program mode, which will allow us to achieve creative effects, compensate for bright lighting that's behind our subject or something like that, to have some control over how program mode functions. TV stands for time value. In Canon terms, it's the same thing as shutter priority. And you can see here these yellow indicators on the sides of the shutter speed. That means we can adjust the shutter speed. And by adjusting the command wheel, the shutter speed changes. In this mode, we select the shutter speed, and the camera will pick the best aperture for the lighting conditions that are in the scene. You can see here that the aperture is blinking. If your aperture is blinking, that means that there is not enough light in the scene for you to get a proper exposure at the apertures that are available for your camera, and you have to select a different shutter speed. Aperture priority is the same thing but the opposite. Whereas shutter priority allowed us to select the shutter speed, AV, which is aperture value, allows us to set the aperture value to pick the aperture, and the camera will calculate the shutter speed. And it's done in the exact same way by just rotating the command wheel to pick the aperture. And same thing, if the shutter speed we have a lot more variability with, so it's a lot harder to get the blinking shutter speed, but in theory you could. If you set the ISO to 12,800 and the aperture to f1.8 and you were out in full sun, that shutter speed would be blinking because the camera cannot take a picture fast enough to give you a proper exposure with those settings. Now up here we have full manual, and you can see here the yellow indicators tell us that adjusting the command wheel will adjust the shutter speed. If we want to adjust the aperture, we hold the AV button down, and now we can adjust the aperture by rotating the command wheel. Program, shutter priority, and aperture priority will give you pretty good photos. And the majority, in fact, of my shooting, more than 90%, is done in aperture priority shooting. And the reason for that is because the camera is calculating the shutter speed, some amount of data for the exposure. With manual, you're going to have a meter like this and an indicator in a perfect world that will tell you whether or not you can take a photo. What you want to do is get that little white block that is underneath this meter bar into the center of the meter bar, and that will give you a proper exposure. And you do that by adjusting your shutter speed and aperture. If you have an incorrect exposure, your camera's still going to take the photo. It's going to do what you tell it to do, regardless of whether or not that's right. So we're going to scroll through these and start looking at these other settings. We're going to start here with Scene Intelligent Auto. Basically, this is your green box setting. Evidenced by the green box. This is full camera control. You have no input into what's going to happen with the images. The camera's just going to do what it wants. Flash off will disable the flash. So this is a good mode if you're in a museum and you want to make sure that the flash will not trigger, because museums may not allow flash, or your kids play, or something like that, where you can take photos but you can't use flashes. These are good ways to prevent the flash from firing. Creative Auto is an auto mode with some creative inputs that you can control. So we're going to be in Creative Auto. Let's select. Oh, I have to hit the Q button to manage these. And now what I can do is we're going to start here with Standard Setting. I can go to Vivid or Soft. These are image controls that affect the way that the image will be recorded. So I think the manual goes into some more detail about what all of them are, but you also have multiple settings that you can select. Push down on the cross pad to access this, and we can increase the effect to make it very bright. We can make something very, very high key. Disable or enable will allow us to enable or disable this mode. Here we go. So these are the different options you have with as your baseline setting with Creative Auto. Select one of these so we have something else we can adjust. Here are your background blur. Basically, this controls either some software. I couldn't find out exactly what it controls, whether it's a software function or whether it is a function of the aperture, but this is how blurry the background's going to be. Single shot shooting, you can set any of your drive modes here to select to have this drive either singly or continuous, self-timer, and so on and so forth, and whether or not you want the flash to turn on automatically or not. These settings by and large are the same for all of the other different modes up here as well. Some of them have slightly different options, but they're all variations on a theme. So that's Creative Auto. It's an automatic mode where you set the parameters that the camera is going to use for automatic image capture. Next up we have Portraits, and Portraits give you the ability with the Q button to manage some of those same Creative Auto settings. The difference here is that Portrait comes with a preset of parameters, things like and some things that you can do to set it up to be most successful. So you can control some of the way that your portrait set will look in this setting, but you cannot control the base parameters for this setting. With Portrait, some of the things you can do to make it most successful are use the longest end of your telephoto lens or your zoom lens like this 18 to 55, you'd want to use the 55. If you're using a 70 to 200, you'd want to use anything that's really that's longer than about 100. And then you'd also want to have your subject about 10 feet or more in front of the background behind them to get a nice blurry background and some isolation, as they call it, of the subject from the background. Landscape is a little bit the same, but exactly the opposite. Instead of being at the 55 focal length on your kit lens, you'd want to be at 18. Whereas the portrait mode will give you a shallow depth of field that is just your portrait subject in focus. The landscape mode gives you a very deep depth of field that is everything in front of your camera in focus, and it really does work best with wide-angle lenses. Close-up photos are designed, again, like portraits, for the long end of your kit zoom lens, and they are designed for you to be as close as possible to your subject to photograph it. So with this, you want to get up close, and the camera will bias your photo towards close subjects. Sports is best with a telephoto lens, and this will do everything it can to give you the fastest shutter speed that the camera can deliver for you in the setting, in the lights, the scene that you put in front of it, to freeze motion for sports action. And now this last one is your scene mode. So these are all different scene modes. This is more scene modes. So these are less often used scene modes, and we're going to access them by using the Q button. There we go. So they are, starting over here, kids, food, candlelight, night portrait, handheld night scene, HDR backlight correction. All right, let's talk about what these are. With kids, the camera starts by using the center autofocus point and locks onto a moving kid. So to use this, you'd want to have your kid out in front of you and have them be in the center of the frame when you start focusing. The autofocus will then track the kid that you started focusing on as that kid moves throughout your frame. So basically what you're doing is telling the camera, here is my kid, they're in the center, and just follow them as they do crazy kid stuff. If you're shooting in live view, continuous shooting options are not available with this mode, so ideally you want to use the optical viewfinder when you're shooting in kid setting. And of course, by the way, you can see similar settings that we have here to the previous Creative Auto setting. This next one is food. Food is not suitable if people are going to be in your frame. This is not a setting you want to use because it will adjust the color of your images in a way that can often create very unrealistic looking skin tones. So basically what this does is this overrides color tone setting to standard if you use the flash. So any color tone settings that you would enter here, scaling it from blue to red, the camera will override with the flash. But other than that, this is a mode designed to make food look more appealing. Candlelight is a mode specific for candlelight shooting. And what it uses is only the center autofocus point. That way you get the most illumination in your image in the center of it. So this is going to help set you up for success by using only the center autofocus point so that you have, let's say, your kid blowing out the birthday party candles right here in the center, and the kid's face is right in the center where the most light is because they're right near the candlelight. And that's why that's set up that way. Also, live view is not usable with this mode. Only the optical viewfinder and the pop-up flash is disabled, but the autofocus beam is not disabled. Night portrait mode is recommended for use with a tripod, and basically what this does is this takes a long exposure with flash. So let's say, for instance, that you have a friend and you're out hanging out with them at night and there's a bridge in the background, and you want to get a picture of your friend and that bridge. You would use this, tell them to stand still until the photo's done. The camera would take a picture of them with the flash to illuminate your friend, and then a long exposure would continue after that flash is triggered to capture the details and the lights on the bridge in the background. Otherwise, everything behind your friend would just be very dark. If your friend moves after the flash is fired, then any lights behind them will show through your friend, and it's going to be kind of a weird effect. So to use this one, you'll want a tripod or something like a picnic table to set your camera on, and you'll want to make sure that your friend doesn't move until after the entire exposure is done. Handheld night scene is the same thing, but for handheld use. And then HDR backlight control takes 3 shots and merges them in the camera using a standard HDR merging process. This requires that the camera be held very steadily, and it's recommended that a tripod be used if it's available. Honestly, any modern software can probably do HDR merging as well, or probably better than this camera. This is a 5-year-old camera at this point. The HDR software and algorithms in modern photo editing software are 5 years more advanced. And if you're going to shoot HDR, rather than doing it in camera here, it's a really good idea just to shoot raw and stack those raw images or adjust them into an HDR in post. Okay, so now that we've gone over what all of these things are, we can talk about some of the other functions down here that will make a little bit more sense now. For instance, the AV button. We've talked about using this in manual mode to switch between adjusting the shutter and aperture. In the 2 semi-auto modes, which are aperture priority and shutter priority, you can use the AV button to force over or underexpose your image. And in program mode, you can use the AV button to force program shifting to over and underexpose your image as well. The next thing we're going to look at are these buttons here, which are collectively called the cross pad: white balance, autofocus, image setting, drive mode, and set. So each one of these affects something differently. The set button is basically just an OK button. You can also assign a specific task to it, and we'll see how to do that in the third video. We'll start up here with white balance. These are your white balance settings, and you can select a different one based on the setting that you are set to. Custom white balance can be very powerful if you do tabletop product photography for something like an eBay or Etsy store or something like that. If you have a white softbox, you can use custom white balance and live view to manually adjust your white balance settings. Oh, come on. It's not going to let me get in there. Oh yes, I believe custom on this camera, I believe that the custom white balance is set in the menus, so I think we cover that in video 3. But anyway, if you do a lot of little product photography at home with the same lighting setup, you can create a custom white balance setting that you can then use over and over and over again with the same lights and setup to have a consistent look to all of your photos over time. Auto white balance is generally pretty good, and if you shoot in RAW, you can really do a lot to control your images in RAW to make them look consistent as well. The other thing that you can do is if you're shooting you can use these to change the color tone of your images. So if you want to shoot a video like with your buddies, like you're shooting a Michael Bay video, you can use white balance to force your video to have like an intentionally orange cast to it. Next thing we're going to do is talk about the AF. These are your 3 AF modes: one shot, AI focus, and AI servo. Okay. One shot means that your autofocus will find focus and it will keep that focus until you take the photo, even if your subject moves. AI focus is here in the middle because it's going to pick the best autofocus method, either one shot or servo, for the scene. So if you want to just leave it in AI focus, you'll probably more often than not be pretty happy. AI servo is the mode that will track moving objects through a scene, so that if you have a kid or a dog or something running through a scene that you want to photograph, AI servo will track them to keep them in focus. Next is drive mode, and these are your drive modes. Single shot: if you hold the shutter button down, it will take a photo, and it will not take another one until you release the shutter button and press it again. Continuous shooting: as long as you hold the shutter button down, it will take photos. Silent single shot is the same as single shot, but quiet. Believe that this is done only through live view. This is the same as continuous but quiet, and I believe also that it is done also through live view. Self-timer with remote, self-timer with shorter remote, and self-timer, and you can adjust how long your self-timer is in seconds, up to 10. And then the last one here is your picture toning menu. And these are different picture tones, and you can see the names up here. Basically, and you have 3 custom ones that you can set up. Basically, I would suggest just leaving this either in neutral or faithful. Neutral, they're pretty darn close to the same. And just doing any adjusting you have with your raw files in post. You'll have better results that you can take more control of. Once you make a change in here, it's really hard to undo it. If you have just a neutral image file, you can always add things to it, just can't take them away very easily. Now the last thing we're going to talk about is the Q button here, the quick access button. And the Q button allows you to go into this data screen and use the cross pad to scroll to specific things like your metering mode. Click the set button and select a different metering mode, just like that. And by the way, this also has a touch screen on it, so all of the stuff I'm doing with this cross pad, you can also do with your fingers. I just don't want to get my fingerprints all over the screen so that you can actually see what's underneath it. So, at any rate, all of these different settings you can select with the Q button and change on the fly. This is your flash exposure compensation. You can either overclock or underclock your flash. This is your actual exposure compensation, so you can intentionally overexpose or underexpose your images. ISO, of course, I forgot to mention that. Picture toning we just talked about. White balance we just talked about. auto white balance bracketing right here. You can shift and balance your white bracket across across multiple images if you want to see how different white balance settings affect different images. This is your dynamic range, which is basically HDR light that you can use to amplify shadows or reduce highlights. Honestly, if you shoot RAW, you don't need to use that at all. Normal flash firing. This is how you can adjust your flash. Normal basically is first curtain flash, easy wireless flash, and custom wireless flash. So let's select first curtain. Oops. Basically what this means is that when you push the shutter button, the first curtain drops down to the bottom of the camera. This flash fires as soon as that first curtain finishes its travel. This allows you to adjust the remote channel for your wireless flash control, and this would work with Canon Speedlight flashes. And custom wireless flash may work for other brands of flash. I'm not sure. I don't do that much flash photography, and I don't own any Canon flashes to test this with. And the last thing we're going to do in this video is talk about how to take a picture. We've done everything leading up to how to take a picture except actually do it. So we've seen how to dial in all of these different settings. All you want to do is pick the setting that you're going to use, get your exposure information input, decide whether or not you're going to use autofocus or manual focus, however you want to do it. And then when you've got your image framed and you're comfortable with how it's going to turn out, you just take a picture, just like that. It's that simple. Once you have all of your settings input into the camera, the act of taking a photo, really easy. And that's it for video 2. In video 3, we're going to go over everything in the menus. We're going to talk in depth about all of this stuff right here and how all of these settings affect your images and some recommendations for how you can maximize your photo quality with these different settings. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you in video 3. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If this video was helpful and useful to you, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and that I'm producing and creating content which is helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about responding every couple of days and answering whatever questions you have to the best of my ability. If you'd like to subscribe to find out when I have more videos about how to use cameras, photographic techniques, or the best practices for the tools of the trade, by all means, please subscribe and check that notifications bell to be alerted when new content arrives. If you'd like to support the channel by joining with a membership, there are now membership options for this channel at different tiers that will give you different benefits if you would be interested in that. And one last thing, thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Won't we, Steinbeck? What's that look about?